spoken about how it's ridiculous to see all violence as the same, because one side here is being occupied and one side is the occupier. In fact, though, most of the mainstream media and the big Western powers, they do the opposite. Basically, any violence by the occupier is legitimate and any violence by the occupied isn't. So it's completely through the looking glass. And the best example of this was from this week. It was a response of Joe Biden's spokesperson on the Middle East to the airstrikes and the rockets we're currently seeing.
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, a military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the use of force.
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
Broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you, I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
You're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do you
regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't referring.
Do you don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. Are you saying that you do not, if it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not in a position to debate the legalities from up here. What our message is one of de-escalation.
That was just disgusting to watch, actually, essentially. He's saying when Israel bombs Gaza, when Israel bombs Palestinians, that's self-defense. States have a right to self-defense. If they feel like they're at risk from rockets which are being fired, then they have a right to respond, essentially however they want. If they bomb tower blocks, so be it. That's the right to self-defense. He's saying, but the Palestinians, you see, they don't have a state, so they don't have the right to self-defense. All they have is terrorism. And so you can see this way whereby he has basically automatically legitimized the violence of the oppressor and automatically delegitimized the violence of the oppressed. That's why I say it's through the looking glass. It is, the precise opposite of what any moral compass should tell you in this situation. As Ash says, you can have legitimate debates about how oppression should be resisted, right? So there will be people that say, even if a people are colonized and oppressed, I'm not comfortable with them using violence. It's a fine position. But to say the oppressor can use violence, the oppressed cannot, and to almost have these sort of rules, which means that's by definition the case, it's just phenomenally disgusting, really. Ash, I want to bring you in on this because this isn't the Trump administration. This is the Biden administration. And we know that, on certain issues, when it comes to, fiscal policy, for example, they have been fairly progressive. And Biden is seen to be a president who does, listen to the left. But when it comes to foreign policy and policy on things like Palestine, I mean, it's hard to imagine a response that's more reactionary than that, really, isn't it?
I mean, look, when it comes to America thinking that the security interests of Israel are in line with American geopolitical interests, this is, of course, something which extends for a much longer durée than the appearance of Trump. And it is truly, I think, an issue of bipartisan agreement. This is sometimes quite crudely, I think, understood as the power of the Israel lobby, but it's actually something which I think, you can understand through the power of America in the region of the Middle East, and seeing Israel as a vehicle for the advancement of American and more generally Western interests in the region. And so that's why I think you do not have a serious tilt leftwards from Joe Biden or his spokesperson, although you may see perhaps much less flagrant support for the expansion and the activities of Netanyahu, and you might have a bit more considered or muted condemnation than you certainly would have had under Trump. But when it comes to the fundamentals about the recognition of a Palestinian state, the recognition of a Palestinian state and people's right to self-determination, to resistance, to self-defense, you are not going to see something which is all that different from what a Republican president or indeed what President Trump would say.